The year is 1930. You're standing on a dirt road somewhere in the middle of nowhere. In front of you, a farmhouse. Paint peeling, tin roof rusting, maybe a thin thread of smoke curling from the chimney. The sun's been down for an hour and the darkness here is thick. Heavy in a way most of us living in cities and suburbs have never really known. There's no glow on the horizon, no faint hum of traffic, and inside that farmhouse, the only light comes from a kerosene lamp. Its flame flickering on cracked wallpaper. That was the night for most of rural America, long after city streets had turned into canyons of light. By the early 1930s, 9 out of 10 farms in the United States still don't have electricity. 9 out of 10. Cities had been lit for decades. Broadway blazed like daylight in the 1890s. But the people growing the food, milking the cows, holding up the country, they lived in a world that shut down when the sun disappeared. This is the story of how that changed, how a country that once looked like a checkerboard of light and shadow finally brought electricity to the last dark corners of the map. And like everything in American history, it wasn't just about technology. It was about money, politics, class, and a fight over whether progress would be for everyone, or just the people who could afford it. By 1925, electricity had become normal in American cities. You flipped the switch and things happened. Lights came on, fans spun, refrigerators hummed, radios crackled voices out of thin air. But on the farm, nightfall was a wall. Farm kids studied by kerosene lamps or didn't study at all. Their mothers did laundry with water boiled on wood stoves, wringing shirts by hand. Their fathers woke before dawn to haul buckets of water from wells and ended their days when the sun disappeared. Because working by lamplight was clumsy and dangerous. Meanwhile, private utilities, the companies that strung the wires and built the plants, weren't interested. There was no money in it. Too expensive, they said. Too few customers, they said. They could run a single mile of power line in the city and get 100 paying customers. Out in the country, that same mile might reach 2 houses, maybe 3. From the company's point of view, it didn't make sense. From the farmer's point of view, that was a polite way of saying, you don't matter enough. They were stuck in the 19th century while the rest of America sped ahead into the 20th. And here's the thing. People remembered. They remembered reading about Edison's light bulb in the paper in 1879, or seeing newsreels of electrical streetcars humming down avenues. But decades later, when the city folks were bragging about their new toaster ovens, the farmer's wife was still cooking over firewood, cleaning soot off her hands. There's a line in a report from the time. One farmer told an investigator, "We send the cream to the city, and they send back the butter wrapped in electric light." It's not like nobody tried. Some wealthy farmers cobbled together private generators, strung wires from town, but those were exceptions. State fairs started to feature electric farm exhibits, showing shiny milking machines, pumps, and lights. These were promises, they were bait. Imagine standing in a dusty fairground tent in 1910, watching a salesman flip a switch, and suddenly, there's an electric pump filling a trough. Your brain is telling you this is the future, but you know that the future isn't coming to your farm anytime soon. Promises don't string lines, and for decades the countryside waited. And the explanation was always the same. Too expensive, not enough demand, the market won't bear it. Because here's the brutal truth, the market wasn't going to do it. The utilities had run the numbers, they didn't like what they saw, and without somebody forcing their hand or building a new system entirely, rural America would stay in the dark. So by the early 1930s, farmers were waiting, the lines weren't coming. The electric company said it wasn't worth it. The market didn't justify the miles of poles of wire. That's the story everyone heard. That wasn't the whole story. Because the companies making those decisions, the ones saying no, they weren't who you thought they were. In fact, the company sending your bill each month might not even been making its own decisions at all. If you really wanted to understand why those lines weren't coming to the countryside, you had to go higher. You had to climb the pyramid, and the higher you climbed, the stranger things got. Let me tell you about the shadow empires of power. By the late 1920s, the U.S. electric industry looked simple enough from the outside. Every town had a power company. Maybe it was Northern Plains Power and Light or Great Western Electric. Names that felt local, safe, familiar. But most of those local companies weren't local at all. They were just faces, masks. Because by 1929, 8 holding companies controlled 3/4 of all the electricity in America. 8. And those 8 weren't the names printed on trucks or printed on bills. They were names like Insul, Electric Bond and Share, names the average farmer had never heard, but whose boardroom decisions determined whether his lights came on or stayed dark. So here's how the empire worked. Start with a company, say Great Western Electric. It runs a few local power plants, serves some small towns. Now a big holding company comes along. They buy up a controlling interest, maybe 51% of the stock. But they don't just buy the stock. They create another company to buy it. A paper entity with no real assets except its ownership of that stock. And that company, it's owned by another one, and another, and another. And by the time you trace it all back, you've got 5, 6, sometimes 7 layers of ownership. Corporate pyramid. And at the top sat the true power, the holding company executives in New York or Chicago, people you would never see, who would never set foot in your dusty little town, but who controlled the wires above your head. Why so many layers? Simple. Money and control. Each layer could sell stocks or bonds, skimming off fees and dividends. The same dollar of investment could be leveraged 3, 4, 5 times over. It was a magician's trick. They turned $1 into 5 and used those dollars to buy up more utilities, which generated more money, which created more layers. And no one, not customers, not regulators, not even many investors, could really see who was in charge. A farmer in Iowa might have gotten his bill from Midwestern Rural Power, thinking some local men in Des Moines were running the show. But those guys were taking their orders from Minneapolis. Minneapolis took its orders from Chicago. Chicago took its orders from Wall Street. And Wall Street, they didn't care much about bringing light to some farm at the edge of country. They cared about stock price. By the late 1920s, this pyramid swallowed nearly everything. The Insul Empire, named for Samuel Insull, Edison's former right-hand man, alone controlled hundreds of utilities. And he wasn't the only one. Electric Bond and Share, National Power and Light, United Gas and Electric. These companies didn't just own utilities, they owned webs of utilities, finance companies, and even banks. It was all connected. But you couldn't see the web unless you were standing at the very top. That invisibility, that was the point. Because when rural America asked, why aren't the lines coming to us? The answer came back in 100 different local accents. Too expensive, not enough demand, the market doesn't justify it. The real answer was this. Somewhere in that corporate pyramid, a man in New York office had decided it wasn't worth the return on investment. And it wasn't just neglect. These holding companies, these shadow empires, weren't just sitting on their thrones doing nothing. They were active. They were predatory. They used those layers of ownership to hide debt, shuffle losses, dodge taxes. They set urban rates lower to keep politicians happy, and rural rates higher, leading the people who could least afford it. One historian called it a financial house of mirrors. But here's the thing about mirrors. Eventually, someone looks behind them. Then came the crash. The Great Depression didn't just break banks. It broke trust. People who had lost everything, farms, jobs, homes, started looking at their power bills and asking questions. Congress started asking too. Investigators hauled utility executives into hearings. They pried open the books, and what they found was worse than anyone imagined. Holding companies were inflating stock prices by making subsidiaries buy services from each other at jacked up rates. They sold worthless bonds, promising dividends that were only paid by borrowing more money from further down the chain. It was a Ponzi scheme, except the product wasn't a get-rich-quick scam. It was electricity. By 1932, the outrage boiled over. Newspapers screamed headlines calling holding companies the most efficient, wealth-extracting machine ever devised. Franklin Roosevelt's team went to war. And in 1935, Congress passed the Public Utility Holding Company Act, the death sentence for the shadow empires. The act forced them to simplify. They could only own utilities in one region, no more 7-layer pyramids, no more hiding losses down the chain, no more pretending a local power company was anything but an outpost of Wall Street. The empires collapsed, and when they did, they left something behind. A vacuum. Here's the important thing. When those holding company towers fell, they didn't just take their stockholders down with them. They took down the old excuse. For decades, the answer to rural America's question, when do we get electricity, had been a cold calculation, made in a boardroom hundreds of miles away. Now, those boardrooms were empty. The strings had been cut, and into that vacuum stepped something very different. Not another empire, not another Wall Street scheme. Something the farmer themselves helped build. A new idea, almost radical at the time, that electricity could be a cooperative project, not just a commodity. And that's where the Rural Electrification Administration comes in. In 1935, Roosevelt created the Rural Electrification Administration, the REA. Here's how it worked. The government loaned money, cheap money, to local cooperatives. Farmers organized, they borrowed, and they built the lines themselves. It wasn't easy. Imagine a group of farmers, none of them engineers, digging post holes by hand, stringing wires across miles of muddy fields. They weren't just building a power grid, they were building the future they'd been promised for 50 years. Within 5 years, hundreds of rural co-ops had sprung up. And for the first time, electricity wasn't a luxury, it was a right. The changes came fast, and they were radical. Farm kids could do homework after dark. Women, who had done the brutal, endless work of laundry, cooking, scrubbing, got electric irons, washing machines, refrigerators. One study found that electrified farms cut women's weekly housework by 30 hours. 30 hours. That's almost a second work week erased by the flip of a switch. And then there was the radio. The first time a farm family turned on a radio, the world opened up. News, music, Roosevelt's voice, coming straight into the kitchen during the fireside chats. It didn't just change how they lived, it changed how they felt about living. Not everyone was thrilled. There were old-timers who didn't trust electricity, said it was dangerous or unnecessary. Some even feared it would soften farm life, make people lazy. But once the lines were up, there was no going back. By the 1950s, the gap between city and country was closing. Not just in light bulbs and appliances, but in culture, in opportunity, in what was even possible. Think about this. The last U.S. farm was wired for electricity in the early 1970s. There are people alive today who remember what it was like to live in that darkness. Electricity wasn't just power. It was dignity. It was connection. The switch flipped and the world changed. Next time you turn on a light or plug in your phone, think about that farm back in 1930. Think about the miles of darkness between one house and the next. And think about what it took to bring the light. If you're serious about building a career in the electrical field, now is the time to level up. At primesystemsacademy.com, we offer beginner-friendly courses. Join a growing community of future power professionals and take charge of your career path before the industry leaves you behind. That's it for today's episode. If you found this helpful, share it with a friend, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and stay tuned. Until next time, stay safe, stay sharp, and keep powering forward.